Mike Swetnam, our CEO, who's out of CONUS right now, and General Al Gray, the 29th Commandant of the Marine Corps, who's the chairman of our Board of Regents. We welcome you here today for this outstanding panel that Jonas put together. Dr. Alexander always seems to put together just the right amount of talent and expertise, and he includes it so well as they offer their opinions and then allows you to make some comments back. As I looked at the topic, I couldn't help but think, with the growing population in the world today, and with the amount of poverty that we see throughout the world, and we see the squalor that exists, it is just a perfect petri dish for the wrong things to happen in too many places. And this with the prisoner and the terrorist challenge, if I was a terrorist, I don't think I'd have to go too far to find those opportunities to look for the right type of character who's desperate enough, who doesn't have the education, and is just looking to either make some trouble or earn some money. And that's a bad combination in the world. And it's probably not going to get any better, unfortunately. We're going to see some hot spots that are going to offer some opportunities here, that are offering them today. And that's why this topic is probably so crucial on how we and other countries deal with this emerging issue that's going to be with us for a long, long time. It always has been, but the number of people that were available for the target set haven't been as prevalent as they've had. So with that, Yona, I thank you for putting this together today. I thank our panel members for coming. I thank you, the audience. Please enjoy it, listen to what they say, and please challenge them back, because that's the beauty of these seminars. So, Yona, thank you very much.
Thank you, General. Thank you. All right, don't forget it. Thank you very much. Before we continue, would you be so kind to turn off this little thing? And it's a blessing, but I won't make any other comments about it. So that's number one. Let me first again join General Risk and welcome you. We expect Ambassador Zango to be here any minute. I spoke to him this morning, and I want to welcome the panelists. I just will introduce them very quickly at this point. Ambassador Javier Ruperas, who is the former ambassador of Spain to the U.S. and Assistant Secretary General, Director of Counterterrorism of the UN Security Council. Next, as I said, Ambassador Zango. Next to him is Don Arbel, the former Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of Israel, and currently a scholar at the American University in the Brookings. Next to him is Professor Louis Shelley, who is Director of Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at the George Mason University. And next to him is, to her, is Colonel Tim Murphy, who was a former senior staff member in the U.S. Air Force and State Department, and also served as a military attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. And last but not least is Professor Don Wallace, who is the chairman of the International Law Institute. He's a colleague of mine for many years, and he's going to make closing remarks. I may also thank, in addition to the International Law Institute, the Center for National Security Law of the University of Virginia Law School, my friends and colleagues, Professor John Norton Moore and Professor Bob Turner. They produced an outstanding, if I may, study on the legal issues in the struggle against terrorism. We distributed the information, and I would urge you to look at this very seriously. It's one of the best studies that were produced by scholars through the University of Virginia Law School. Now, the purpose of this seminar, as you know, is to deal with some issues related to the terrorist prisoners challenge, such as propaganda, such as recruitment, such as operational activities in the jail itself. And then, of course, we have to look at other manifestations related to this problem, like riots and jailbreaks and prisoner releases. Now, I think that the way to do it, or to deal with that issue very closely, is first to have Ambassador Paris to provide a general overview, context, if you will, to the problem, and I'll come back to it in a minute. But I cannot resist, as an academic working this field for many years, and trying to answer some critical questions for the 21st century, at least for the next 100 years. Ambassador Zango, please. Right there. I really appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
Well, if you wish, whatever. We're just beginning.
No problem.
All of us are struggling with many of the issues related to the challenge of terrorism. And as we approach the 12th anniversary of 9/11 next month, there are two critical issues on the strategic level that I think we have to ponder again and again and again. One is the worst yet to come after 9/11. And then the short answer, from my point of view, would be, yes, it's only a question of when and with what impact. And of course, all of us are concerned now about what's happening in Syria with the chemical weapons and the march of the Iranians towards the nuclear bomb, their program at least. So if this is the case, that the worst is yet to come, the next question is, strategically, are we going to survive civilization on the strategic level? Then I would like to come back to the prisoners issue, and here again on the tactical level, if you will, and perhaps even strategic, and the question that I think we have to ponder during the discussion today and in general, whether releasing terrorism from jail does fuel the flame of violence and terror around the world, and what are some of the implications nationally and internationally. Again, as an academic, I would like to provide a footnote in terms of the historical lesson here, because it is related to our discussion. For example, if we look at the anniversary of the month, the anniversary during the month right here of August, particularly focusing on the victimization of diplomats and diplomatic missions around the world, I think we can come to one conclusion. So what else is new? Going back to 1979, the takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, then the attacks in Beirut in the early 80s against the American embassies, the French and the others as well, and finally last year the attack in Benghazi. So if one looks at the anniversaries, we can see assassination of American ambassadors all the way in Guatemala, in Cyprus, and so on, and the bombing of the U.S. Embassies in Kenya and in Tanzania that happened this month. So what lessons did we learn? And again, attacks, for example, directed against the United Nations headquarters in Baghdad, going the way back to 2005. Now, this particular month of August, we witnesses the closing of dozens of embassies, Americans and Western and others, because one of the reasons was because of the jailbreaks that we have seen, for example, in Libya, in Iraq, and Pakistan. So I think we have to relate the nature of the threat to the issue of prisoners and the prison breaks and so forth. Fortunately, we do have a very distinguished panel, as I said, and we have Ambassador Javier Paras, who has a very distinguished career as a diplomat, but also as a politician and writer for many, many years. We cannot go into great details in terms of his background because you have the information that we provided. So I just will mention his extraordinary contributions in Addis Ababa, in Warsaw, in Finland, and Geneva, and elsewhere at the United Nations. For example, he was Assistant Secretary General in New York for several years, Executive Director of the Counterterrorism Committee of the Security Council. He served also in Parliament, and as far as I'm concerned, I'm trying to look at the victimization of humanity. And tragically, he was kidnapped by the ETA terrorist group in Spain, held for a month. And I really hope we can share some of his experiences and lessons. I must say that from the academic point of view, we were honored to have the contribution of Ambassador Paras over the years. When he was in Washington, he lectured at some of our seminars and conferences and so forth. In fact, one of the events that I would like to call your attention to relates to a seminar we had in the National Press Club on Latin America. And we had a number of ambassadors, for example, from Mexico, Colombia, Costa Rica, and he spoke as well. We published his remarks, and I would be delighted to provide you with copies of his contribution. And we look forward to his remarks, and we discussed some of these issues and possibilities. And one possibility is perhaps to deal with several case studies, including the experience of Spain, the Irish case, Colombia, and so on. So we look forward to your remarks, and then we'll introduce again the panel.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Alexander, for your words. Thank you very much for your kindness and generosity. Certainly, this is not the first time that I'm being invited by the Potomac Institute, so it's with great pleasure and honor that I come back to your invitation. And I'm sure that we will continue to cooperate very fruitfully in the future. And thank you to you all for being here, in particular to my good friend, the Ambassador of Spain, who has been kind enough to come here to listen to us. The terrorist prisoners challenge is a very vast subject, and certainly I'm going to try and be short and brief to give you some of my thoughts about this problem. Let me start perhaps by trying to ask one of the questions put forward by Professor Alexander, whether we will survive. Certainly we will survive. I think that we've been going through quite a number of tests through the ages, and this is a serious one, but we will survive. I'm sure about that, and I'm sure that civilization will survive. But certainly we have to fight for it. It's not a given. It's not a gift which is going to be given to us, because certainly there are quite a number of people around there which are trying to do everything they can to destroy civilization as we know it right now. But we will survive. But speaking about terrorist prisoners and the challenges they pose, we have to remind ourselves first and foremost of one one basic thing, is that as far as society is concerned, it's absolutely vital to keep those terrorist prisoners in prison, in jail, because after all, that's the place they deserve to be, and that's the only place where society can be secure about what they do and they don't do. But at the same time, we have to bear in mind that for the terrorists to be in jail is not a very comfortable situation indeed, but it is something they try to exploit and to use for their own personal, collective, community purposes, and this is something we have to bear in mind as well. They tend to present themselves as the victims of terrorism, which is a rather peculiar approach to the thing. What do we know about terrorists in prison? What do we know about terrorist prisoners? Well, they are there because they have endangered national or international security. They have been going against international and national laws and regulations. So one other thing which perhaps seems to be very basic, but we have to remind ourselves that terrorists are in prison not because of a whim, of an arbitrary whim of the society or the states. They are in prison because they deserve to be in prison, because they have been violating all those laws and regulations. At the same time, we have to remind ourselves that terrorists in prison have the right to be treated accordingly to the prevailing laws and regulations, even when sometimes rather difficult to tell us that they have that right, but they have the right to be protected by the rule of law. We cannot act, we cannot behave the way they do against the terrorists. So this is something which makes a very significant difference between what the terrorists do and what civilized societies do in treating terrorists. Terrorists in prison are not to be treated as common criminals, and certainly are not to be put together with them. They are not common criminals, in spite of the fact that sometimes they tend to appear as common criminals. They are not, because the justification and the ideology they have when committing all those crimes is not exactly what they have, what a common criminal has in mind. The terrorist mind is geared to the destruction of the basic fabric of free societies, and certainly that puts them in a very special category. And when drafting laws and regulations concerning how to treat the terrorists, this is something we have to bear in mind, and not to make the mistake that they are exactly like other criminals. They cannot be put together in prisons together with the common criminals. The terrorists in prison, that's something that is very easily drawn from our experience. Terrorists in prison go through a variety of feelings and attitudes, simultaneous or consecutively. They tend to be radicalized when they are in prison. They try and make propaganda of their own feelings and ideas when they are in prison. They show some degree of arrogance at times, but at the same time, when time passing by, they feel despair, they feel boredom, and they feel hopelessness. And this is something we have to remind as well, because the psychology of the terrorists in prison, if dealt in an adequate way, will help the fight against terrorism itself. And terrorists in prison, for their colleagues in the outside world, become pawns in the game against society and state. They become pawns because eventually they might be the hostages to be changed for some sort of other thing coming from the state, because they know that eventually they could be used as pressure to be exerted on states and governments, because at the same time they feel themselves that they are heroic examples to be taught to their own kin and people who follow them, because they are examples to be followed, because they are victims to be remembered. That's the victimization, but the heroification at the same time of the terrorists who appear as the martyr, or as the warrior, or as the freedom fighter, the fighters for noble causes. And this is something we have to bear in mind as well when trying to counteract what they are trying to inflict upon the psychology of their community. The bottom line is again a very simple one. They are especially dangerous criminals who deserve tough punishments and universal wrath and condemnation. And any other approach would be extremely self-defeating for the free societies. But I would like, as Professor Alexander mentioned before, I would like to concentrate on the cases of the prisoners, of the terrorist prisoner release, and at the same time try and draw some lessons in different circumstances. I will examine the case of Israel, the case of Colombia, the case of Ireland, and the case of Spain. Will be rather brief glimpses on those countries through the experience that we've been getting through the years. And through them, I'm trying to share with you some thoughts about modern terrorism in general and the best way to fight against it. As you will see, there are different formulas and approaches responding to the different challenges and needs as perceived by different societies and notions. Because everyone condemns terrorism, but not everyone has the same notion of terrorism. And I remember of my years in the United Nations that one of the things we have to try and solve, and they didn't solve, was the definition of terrorism. Not everyone agrees on what terrorism is about. Not everyone has the same recipe to fight against terrorism. And even the recipes for a given state, for a given government, can change with time and circumstances. Let me start with Israel. And Israel has quite recently, few days ago, has recently released more than 100 Palestinian terrorists detained in Israeli prisons and sentenced to long terms. The release has been authorized by the government, by a divided government, I understand. I think the numbers are 13-9 within the Israeli government. And from the start, that release poses, or any other release, but this one in particular poses a number of questions. Was it legal? We have to suppose it was legal because it was authorized by the Israeli government, but all those releases in the first place pose a problem of the legality of it, which is the law according to which those prisoners who have been formally sentenced to a number of years in prison have been released. The consequences of it, and Professor Alexander made a number of references to it, because with that release and any other release, we find the terrorists anew in the streets. They have not recanted, they have not relented, they have not repented, they are free, so most likely they will go back to where they used to be and try and do exactly what they used to do in the past. At the same time, that release and any other release produces anger and despair in some sectors of the Israeli society, and mainly those sectors which are unfortunately rather wide, who have been directly affected by the crimes of those people who have been released. And at the same time, that feeling of despair and anger could be unfortunately compared with the feeling of victory on the Palestinian front, on the terrorist front, because as we've seen these last few days, those who were released were received as heroes by the president of the Palestinian Authority. They were treated as heroes, and there doesn't seem to be any sort of inclination to recognize what they did, which were really awful crimes. But as you know, there is a context to that. Why the Israeli government decided to release those prisoners was, there is a new beginning, let's hope a good beginning, to peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. And the decision taken by the Israeli government was understood, certainly with some degree of prodding on the part of the American government, as a goodwill gesture to facilitate the beginning of those conversations. But I was struck by reading these last few days, precisely the days after the release, a piece of news in the Washington Post where the father of one Israeli young man who had been killed by one of those now released reflects very clearly the conflicting feelings of the moment, as quoted again as the Washington Post. He said, and I quote, "I think they are murderers who don't need to be alive. But what difference does it make what I think or don't think? If our son's murderers were released as part of a peace agreement, it would have been easier for me. That, at least, it was of something worthwhile to humanity, worthwhile to the people of the world. But for Ciro, just to talk is something else. And he added, peace is something every human being yearns for. The question of price for peace is another thing. And then that release, as many other releases, sort of poses us a number of questions. One single important question: could leniency towards terrorists be justified by the results? Which is the admissible price to be paid for peace? Does everything depends on context? Is relativism in these and other aspects of our daily life be ever present? Let's go to Colombia. The Colombians have been fighting against a vicious insurgency, terrorist activity by the FARC, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, for more than 60 years now. And several Colombian presidents have tried a combination of military actions and attempts to negotiation to put an end to the problem, which has seriously impaired the ability of the Colombian state to function and has cost lives by the thousands and damages and material damages by the billions. It was President Álvaro Uribe, who was president between 2002 and 2010, the first to conduct a very robust and successful military action against the insurgents, whose power and influence were greatly diminished as a consequence of it. But his successor, who was his defense minister during the time Uribe was the president of Colombia, President Juan Manuel Santos, has decided to open direct negotiation with the guerrilla on the basis of 5 points. Those points are agrarian development, political participation of the insurgents, including the release of the prisoners, an end to the conflict, including the commissioning of weapons, the dealing with illicit drugs. The FARC have become the perfect example of what is today known as narco-terrorism, and the rights of the victims. But as it is in the case of Israel, a number of questions remain open. The first one is, why to open negotiations with the terrorists in the moment of the worst weakness? How to give legal framework to the release of the terrorist prisoners or to the eventual amnesty of those responsible for crimes against humanity? How to articulate the presence of the terrorists in the political arena? Like in Israel, the public opinion remains ambivalent towards the president's initiative. In fact, former President Uribe is ferociously and very vocally opposed to it and waits for the results. We could always tell ourselves that only a dignified end of the conflict would justify the results. Again, as in the case of Israel, is that the price of peace? And I'm sure that you, even today or yesterday, you saw in the news that the President Santos has decided to announce that he was going to submit to a referendum the result of the peace negotiations. That was a move which was immediately opposed by the terrorists themselves, because they do not want to hear from the Colombians whether they accept or not the result of those negotiations. What they want is to change the regime. And they would like that result of the negotiations, whatever that might be, to be submitted to a special sort of parliament created for that purpose on an equality basis between the Colombian state, the Colombian parliamentarians and themselves. So, but again, the question is, which is the price of peace? Is it worth paying that price? Is it justifiable all those negotiations with all the despair and anger and suffering which they provoke, in case there is peace at the end of the tunnel? Ireland. I'm sure you remember the 1988 Good Friday Agreement between the governments of, which was a rather complicated agreement between the United Kingdom, the Republic of Ireland, the political forces within Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, and so on and so forth. Mainly involving the two warring factors there in Ireland, which were the IRA, the sort of Catholic side of things, and the Unionist, the Protestant side of things. In fact, the Good Friday Agreement put an end to the decades of terrorism and violence unleashed by the IRA against Britain and its allies in the Ulster. The agreement, which very much like the one in Israel was prodded by the United States of America, and included the formation of a government, a provincial government, with the presence of IRA and the Unionists, the Sinn Féin on the side of the IRA, and the release of hundreds of terrorist prisoners of the IRA. The IRA accepted the decommissioning of weapons under international supervision, but it is today obvious that the terrorists sold the best of the weaponry in the illicit international trade, while giving up only those obsolete or deficient. The IRA, in the meantime, has morphed into the Sinn Féin, whose leaders were notorious chiefs of the terrorists, and Northern Ireland has undoubtedly acquired a more peaceful environment when compared to the times of the so-called Troubles, which were really terrible for the inhabitants of that province. But interreligious tensions remain high, occasional violent activities are not rare, and the dissidents of the IRA remain a question mark for the future. Terrorism has left a profound impact in the life of Ulster, and its population, and bitterness and anger remain visible for those who suffer the actions of the non-terrorists now involved in apparently normal political activities. As a matter of fact, this year, 2013, was the 15th anniversary of the signing of the agreements in 1998. In the month of April, there was a statement made by Prime Minister Cameron, reminded after all the situation was far better than the one they knew in 1988. But at the same time, there were a number of remarks made by journalists and analysts of the situation in Northern Ireland, saying that after all, terrorism has not disappeared, that the inter-religious, inter-society tensions have not disappeared, that people keep on killing each other, though, unfortunately, at a lower level than before. And again, the question should be put against the context. Is Northern Ireland better off now after the 1998 Good Friday Agreement than it was before? I would say yes, is relatively better. But have the Good Friday Agreement made justice for those who suffered from the IRA terrorist activities and for those responsible for them? Certainly not. Sometimes we have to tell us that peace is a rather messy and difficult affair. And let me finish this remark by making some reference to Spain. In Spain, between 1975, immediately after Franco's death, and 1977, just before the first democratic elections to be held in the country since 1936, political and terrorist prisoners were released 4 times. It was thought that, after all, there was a game changer in the life of the country, and that was right. It was a new time, a new era opened after the disappearance of the dictator, and it was worth to show by the authorities a significant degree of generosity towards them who were for political or even violent terrorist activities in prison, to give them that amnesty. But since then, no terrorist prisoners release has taken place. Not one single time prisoners have been released as a consequence of a decision by the government. 3 consecutive governments, it's true, those of González, Aznar and Zapatero, have tried unsuccessful bouts of negotiation with the Basque terrorist group ETA, on the basis of limited penitentiary leniency against the declared end of the so-called end of the armed struggle. But the terrorists wanted nothing short of a total and universal amnesty, which is impossible according to the public opinion and according to the Constitution, to the Spanish Constitution of 1978. The Spanish public opinion has been and remains deeply opposed to the negotiations with the terrorists. The Spanish security forces have led through the years an active and progressively more efficient fight against the terrorists, and international cooperation has added a significant degree of help in that respect. Those three factors, the fact that the public opinion has been adamantly opposed to any negotiations with the terrorists, the fact that the security forces have been more and more efficient in the fight against terrorism, the fact that the Spanish people and governments have been gaining more and more international support in the fight against terrorism, explains why, in a way, we can say that Spain, the Spanish society, the Spanish governments have finally defeated terrorism up to a point. The result is that more than 700 terrorists are now in prison, and the result is that 2 years ago ETA announced that they were putting an end to the violence, to the acts of violence. But ETA has not disappeared, has not announced its disappearance, has not announced a decommissioning of their weapons. Its political terminals remain vocal and active. A limited degree of international support, with the visible presence of the former terrorists of the Sinn Féin and IRA in Ireland, by the way, still there. But the relatively long terms of prison for those detained have been a useful tool to demoralize those who still thought about joining the group, the gang, and indeed those behind bars whose hope of an early release has gone with the wind. But I would add three caveats to that situation, which I think reflects basically the situation in the country right now. Three caveats. The first one, in recent times the Spanish authorities, always within the terms of the law, have granted early paroles to some terrorists responsible for several assassinations. A significant public opinion outcry has followed. The second one is the Spanish Penal Code does not contemplate the death penalty nor life sentences. The maximum period of stay in prison for any criminal is 30 years. Now is 40 years for the terrorist. And the third caveat is that those 30 years could be greatly reduced by good behavior. And to prevent the scandalous result of terrorists guilty of dozens of deaths being freed after a few years, the government has introduced legislation for the terrorists to serve the maximum possible sentence without parole, and even to introduce clauses of interpretation of existing regulations to prevent the scandal of those mass killers being in the street with only half of the sentence served. But these last clauses have been appealed to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg by the lawyers of the terrorists, and we are still precisely these days waiting for the decision of the tribunal in Strasbourg, whether they will accept the idea that certainly cannot be accepted, the idea that those terrorists can go free after a few years in prison, or they will tell the Spanish authorities, the Spanish Parliament, that this is a retroactive decision and cannot be accepted. But just to tell you some of the dilemmas that Spain has been going through in the last few years, dealing with the problem of terrorism, those in prison for acts of terrorism, and how to punish them adequately according to the law, according to justice, and according to the feelings of the public opinion. And finally, I would say that the fight against terrorism in Spain has been basically a success, but not so much the fight against the political wing of the terrorists, now legal in prisons in all the elected instances of the country, be it local, regional, or national. we could ask ourselves whether that was the price to be paid to put an end to the killings. Had the Spanish people, as resilient as we thought they were in that struggle, were the government and the courts always up to their obligations to make respect the laws which declared illegal the parties related to the terrorists? And there, as in the other cases, context help us to understand many things, not necessarily to justify them, but that is always the dilemma between idealism, realism, and expediency. Nothing could show it better than the fight against terrorism and the treatment given to those in prison as responsible for crimes of terrorism. These are some of the things that I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much again for your presence and your patience.
Very much, Mr. Ambassador. If I may ask you one question before we move on. As you know, we worked on a study related to ETA, a challenge to democracy, and obviously your personal case was an important, I think, aspect of our work. What are some of the contributing factors that encourage terrorism? If I may ask you, according to the records, some of the Basque terrorists were released from prison about, I think, a month after you were liberated. And the question arises whether there were any negotiations at that time between the government and the terrorists, which, again, perhaps there are some lessons for the present situation elsewhere around the world.
Yeah, thank you. It's with some degree of humility that I'm going to speak about myself in this. There was no price paid by my liberation at the time I was kidnapped. And I have good reasons to believe that there was no price paid for that liberation, no economic price, no political price. I was talking very much at length with the Prime Minister of the time, Mr. Suarez, and with the Justice Minister of the time, Mr. Cabero, good friends of mine, and they assured me that there was no price. And I'm sure they were right. I mean, it's not that they were trying to give me a rather sweet candy as to tell me that I was freed without anything being paid. But it's true. That Spanish government didn't negotiate. No Spanish government has negotiated the release of any hostage for the prisoners. I know very well that there is a gray area where private people who were affected by the taking of hostages might have been negotiating with the terrorists. Certainly, the Spanish government, the Spanish state, never negotiated with the terrorists. And I knew it very well. Because I was a member of parliament when I was kidnapped. It was a very tough time for all those of us being involved in politics. We knew very well that we were targets of terrorism. We knew very well, even we were instructed how to behave in case we were taken by the terrorists. I remember very well, I was kidnapped in 1979, around a year before Aldo Moro, the Italian politician, was kidnapped, and there was a big dilemma in the Italian society and practically all over Europe whether to negotiate with the terrorists or not, whether to try and set him free or not. At the end, the terrorists killed him, assassinated him, because there was no negotiation. And I remember very well that a year before I was kidnapped, I was very much involved in those talks among ourselves, what to do, what not to do, and I was firmly against the negotiation with the terrorists. So when the time came for me to be kidnapped, I knew very well that the government was not going to negotiate for me. And I understood it. And the terrorists pushed me and forced me to write a number of letters, couple of letters to the Prime Minister asking for the things they wanted to have, and I didn't. I wrote a letter. I wrote 2 letters, but there were letters which, if you read them right now, they were rather convoluted ways of telling the minister not to negotiate because that was going too far, but telling him, well, I understand what you do. And what he did was absolutely brilliant, and I will always remember, not only because it was my freedom which was at stake, because of the magnificent degree of political brilliance that Adolfo Suarez, the Prime Minister of the time, showed in that opportunity, because he built up a public campaign showing me as a champion, as a hero of freedoms, of liberties, of democracy, as to show the terrorists that were they to kill me, they would make a terrible mistake. And that worked. That works. And I've seen a number of statements made after the kidnapping by people related to the terrorists saying, well, after all, that was not a kidnapping which was addressed to get something for the government. It was a kidnapping addressed to the fact that they wanted, the terrorists themselves, they wanted to show that they were able to do it. That was a purely political kidnapping. That the purpose of the kidnapping was exhausted in itself in the fact of kidnapping. So that's my experience. I know very well what you feel when you are kidnapped, and what you know that you don't have any reason to believe that you are going to leave. You don't have any reason to believe that you are not going to be killed the next minute. Now I know very well what that means. So whenever I talk about terrorism, I tell people, well, don't give me lessons about that. I know what the experience goes through. So, but at the same time, I knew very well that by negotiating with the terrorists, by giving up whatever they wanted, was to decrease the degree of the freedom acquired after Franco's death. And that applies to every other situation, be it in Spain, be it in Ireland, be it in the United States, be it in... I know very well that this government, the American government, does not negotiate, and I think that's the line to be followed. And among other things, because when you know that a government does not negotiate, you think twice. And being a terrorist, you think twice about doing anything against that government. Unfortunately, this is not the case of many other governments. So, with all the ups and downs, with all the uncertainties concerning my own life, with all the political dilemmas that I knew very well that the Spanish government was going through at the time, I knew very well that they were going to do what they did, which was not to negotiate. But at the same time, as I've tried to explain, this is not exactly the negotiations with the terrorists, but in the case of lives being involved, is the price of peace. And then every country or every nation or every society follows its own degree of responses according to the relationship of forces. How do you feel that you can deal with the problem? Well, you feel that you are strong enough to end with terrorism by yourself, or you feel obliged to do some degree of negotiation. That's the lesson.
Thank you
again.
Thank you very much. After the other speakers will have the opportunity, we'll come back to you with some questions. And obviously the dilemma that you face and the challenge is really the challenge of civilization in terms of the tension between the concept of if you save one life, it deems as if you save the entire world, and at the same time the cost, the strategic cost, the psychological cost, the political cost. We're going to deal with that, and our next speaker on the agenda is Ambassador Azango, providing a view, Nigeria and Africa. I must say, as an academic, we were very fortunate to have the opportunity, as you know, Mr. Ambassador, to deal with the challenges in Nigeria and Africa for many decades. In fact, one of the major books that we published at CSIS on international violence was with the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, and we're still struggling with the challenges. I'm so grateful that you came. You were generous to participate in our other events related to Nigeria and Al-Qaeda and so forth in the past. And we cordially invite you to continue with your both diplomatic and academic credentials to deal with that. I think here we have a case study of a participant observer of the challenge of terrorism. He was educated in Nigeria and also the University of Birmingham, the UK, and he joins the diplomatic service of Nigeria and serving in a number of posts such as Zimbabwe and Moscow and Washington, and he was a member of the Nigerian delegations to different international conferences combating terrorism and many other assignments. So I think your insights into not only what's happening in Nigeria, but in West Africa, North Africa, and so on, is very valuable for us. And I would welcome you to share your views, and we will have opportunities also to develop a discussion. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Professor Alexander, for that generous introduction. First of all, let me apologize. I'm not going to present a very elaborate paper. I've been away in Harvard for a very rich course, senior executives in national and international security. I thought it was a joke as an academic, but I found it very hectic and very stressful, but nonetheless very rich. So I didn't have time to write a formal paper to make a presentation for this purpose. But my interaction with colleagues from different segments of the continent and the world on variety of issues ranging from nuclear deterrence, chemical and biological warfare, terrorism, human rights, governance really has enriched and widened my scope, and it will come in handy for this discussion. I was privileged to participate on a discourse on Al-Qaeda, the challenge of Al-Qaeda in North Africa and the Sahel last year, and it was very rich, and I found that platform and indeed other opportunities at the Potomac Institute very valuable. And I want to pledge my continued cooperation with you, because you address issues that are very paramount and pertinent to our national survival in Nigeria. Today I'm going to just highlight or raise issues with regard to the terrorist prisoners challenge, lessons learned and future outlook, and try to give you the Nigerian perspectives. Of course, when you talk about the terrorist challenge, the thing that readily comes to mind is Boko Haram in Nigeria. We see Boko Haram as largely part of a greater challenge of terrorism in West Africa and the Sahel in general. We don't see it as simply a Nigerian phenomenon. The potential for it to expand and have global linkage is there, and we kept stressing that it is only when you understand the global ramifications of Boko Haram extending its frontiers beyond Nigeria, then you will understand that it is a major challenge to national and global security. When it started, quite a number thought that it is a simple uprising, a manifestation of similar uprisings, sectarian, religious. But over time, we realized that the aspirational goals of the group and its members really is the linkage with global jihadist movement, and that will ultimately polarize and create more problems, not only for Nigeria, but for West Africa, the Sahel, and the world. Within no time, Boko Haram was able to reach Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, the main terrorist branch in Pakistan, the Taliban, and what have you. So we now realize that it is a much more serious challenge. For us in Nigeria, we see Boko Haram also as a very complex challenge because it came at a time when Nigeria is trying to build an enduring political order. Building democracy is very difficult, particularly in transitional societies, plural societies, with diverse groups, religious, ethnic, and interest groups. Very difficult. Our commitment to building democracy is unparalleled. We are determined. But when you have these challenges, it's become more difficult. Boko Haram came at that time, very bad time for Nigerian leadership, for Nigerian government, and you could see it reflects in how we are trying to ponder over this challenge, trying to build democracy, evolve good governance, the kind of thing that the global community demands now. Today, everybody is talking about governance, leadership, human rights, the rule of law, accountability, transparency. These are the key things, and these are universal attributes. These are things you can't say governance, you want to develop your own governance based on your own criteria. There are standards. When you talk of transparency, accountability, these are universal standards. When you talk of human rights, these are universal standards. So as much as you try, you may try to evolve based on your own experience and your history, yes, but there are certain levels you must reach, global acceptable standards. Boko Haram came at that particular moment, and we are finding things really very difficult. But we are also lucky now the international community is gradually understanding this challenge, and we are forging ahead. Now, specifically to the prisoner challenge in Nigeria, particularly with regard to terrorism, our experience is unique. First, the law on terrorism was passed only June 2013, 2 months ago. So, I mean, because we don't have that challenge of terrorism, in our statutes book, in our legal books, we don't have, the laws are not too straightforward, they are ambiguous. But we now realize with terrorism, with Boko Haram and various terrorist activities, we need to have laws that really deal directly with the issue, unambiguously. So we now have to pass the law. Now, when you don't have the laws, you find it is very difficult to regulate institutions, including prisons, including the conduct of the police, the conduct of security forces, and what have you. So the first challenge we face is the fact that the anti-terrorism law itself just came, and therefore you find law enforcement officers who are using initiative and if you like, ad hoc regulatory mechanisms. And when law enforcement is based on ad hoc regulatory mechanism, you run into one problem or the other. Enforcement becomes difficult. Sometimes it could be based on whims and caprice. This could be subject to abuse. So these are some of the challenges which we face. Then, of course, we also have problems even in housing prisoners because prisoners are treated the same. Prisoners are criminals, common criminals, largely emanating from civil cases, cases against individual, cases against the state. Now you have hardened criminals, you have terrorists who have an ideology, who have an aspiration, not just about the society, but the global perspective towards jihad. You can't put them together. But you don't have a prison designated for terrorists, so what do you do? So these are some of the challenges. So invariably we have a very weak prison system, and that prison system occasioned by lack of capacity in terms of training. The prison officers are not trained to deal with terrorists because we don't have terrorism in our book. Nobody envisaged it. If you tell a Nigerian that a Nigerian will be a suicide bomber, he will tell you no. Nigerians love life and they want to live forever if they have the chance. But boom, it started happening, and it's a reality now that down on us. So we have that a very weak prison system, occasioned by lack of training, lack of capacity, lack of equipment, lack of infrastructure, and sometimes even lack of foresight. You never anticipate that this will happen. It's wrong from the perspective of planning. You should always anticipate that this could happen. Until recently, prison officers in Nigeria don't carry arms. That is the job of the police. So the prisoners, at best, they carry a whip or a wooden stick, and their job is to escort the inmates to court, hand them over to the police, and that's it. And in the olden days, I always remember as a young schoolboy wondering how a prison warder will be moving with 10, 20, 30 prisoners, and he has nothing. He shouts orders at them, and they will obey. And sometimes I used to think that he has some magical way of hypnotizing them to carry such orders. But such was the kind of prisons and society we had. Prisoners were law-abiding. They abide by the rules given by the warders. That has changed fundamentally. You don't escort terrorists to court when you are not armed. He will take you hostage, and of course he will add others so that the stakes are higher. So we have that challenge. Now, of course, when you have a weak prison system, a poor prison system, terrorists will take advantage of that, and they will embark on several things. And as highlighted in the topic, propaganda came in. Terrorists thrive on narratives. Propaganda try to sell their idea, whatever their world view or their global view or what they think about the universe, and all this, sell this idea either within prison or even outside. So they try to change the narrative within and outside prison, and of course this will aid their activities and their recruitment drive, and we found that very clearly. Because we don't have prison system that designate prison for terrorists and the rest, they are mixed, and obviously they will seek to expand their recruitment drive, getting more people on board and all this. And within no time, the next stage is jailbreaks. Jailbreaks are, of course, derived from the fact that the terrorists now realize that this is a weak system. The security system is lapsed. There is so much lapse there. There is no capacity. They devise a very good system of gathering information, intelligence. They try to look at this. They have a large army they have recruited, and behold, they could now organize successful jailbreaks, and they had occurred in several prisons in Nigeria. In fact, one way of terrorists like Boko Haram to demonstrate their potency is jailbreak. You organize one, and you now show to the state that, look, we are here, we could do this, and you try to show your capacity. And that had happened in several prisons in Nigeria. But I think the more challenging one is radicalization. Prisons have provided a very good, comfortable ground for terrorists to seek to extend their numbers in Nigeria. By recruiting common criminals, most of these terrorists are well endowed. Although they don't carry resources to prison, they have linkages. You have terrorists who have linkages that will pay or give stipends to relations of common criminals they have recruited, or ask them to do one or two things outside. The recruitment is not just limited to prison, but even outside. So radicalization is one, recruitment is one, radicalization is another. Of course, radicalization involves the narratives, expanding the narrative, deepening resentment against government. This is very common. It's not just unique to Nigeria, it's everywhere. Of course, you see a situation in Niger Republic, our neighboring country, where Al-Qaeda has started to do that, begin prison radicalization, and then people are now being given a new narrative so that they reject the government, they challenge the authority of the state. So this radicalization is an integral part of that. Now, what has been the response by government? How did we try to confront such challenges? Very briefly. First is the realization that in Nigeria that fighting terrorism is global. We kept reiterating that when we started, even within the level of government, we saw Boko Haram as a very small problem. We didn't see it as a developing situation, as a developing phenomena with a larger global implication. We thought it will stop there, and we looked at it as a purely law and order situation. And that's the mistake you make when you are fighting terrorism. When you think it is a law and order situation, you will just think that it's limited to the police. They apprehend and they deal with it. It's like extinguishing fire. No, it is not. It's a much more expanding phenomena. And we are very lucky we realized that quickly, that it's a global venture. And we needed to reflect so much to look at several angles. One, how the narratives extend, how they cross frontiers, how they recruit, and the linkages that ensure that the linkage between the terrorists in Nigeria and across the border is a symbiotic relation. It helps them move, it helps others to come in. We now realize that Boko Haram was exploiting that seriously. They expand within Nigeria, they extend beyond Nigeria, they do get help from outside, they do come back. What this means is that whenever they need help, they will get it. It means their numbers could not be reduced. Their capacity cannot be reduced. So you need to really attack those linkages, and I think that's what we try to realize that. And then, of course, we realize that fighting it is very complex. Although we know that terrorists are renegades, they are useless, they are not required by the society, but they are our own people. They are our own members. And we need to take so many things into consideration. You don't destroy, we have a proverb in Africa that you don't throw the child with the bath water. When you wash a child, when a child is born, you wash him in clean water and then you throw away the dirty water. You don't throw the child along with the water. So we need to strike a very delicate balance. And the international community see in us or believe that we have obligation to ensure that human rights are maintained, democracy is maintained, the rule of law is maintained even when you are fighting terrorism. I mean, fighting terrorism does not give you right to engage in, if you like, extrajudicial killings, massive massacre, or even destroying the civilian population. You must use, if you like, proportionate force. So it's a very complex thing for us in Nigeria, more so that we are not used to that. So we must ensure justice, we must ensure rule of law, human rights, and global best practice. And how did we do that? We quickly enacted the anti-terrorism law. It is late, but better late than never. The anti-terrorism law was passed by the National Assembly. It spelled out broad provisions for dealing with this challenge, broad provisions in the criminal justice system, in the prison system, and which among the law enforcement agents, security agencies, and government agencies that will deal with the whole phenomena. But most important, it provided, on the one hand, the legal framework for dealing with terrorism under the economic blueprint for dealing with terrorism. We know that dealing with terrorism is not just about law and order. It's also about bread and butter. Terrorists have a resentment, but how do they get to recruit people? They recruit from the most vulnerable, those who are hungry, those who are unemployed, those who are deprived. So we must try to narrow that gap. We must try and ensure that we have less deprived, we have less people who are hungry, we have less people who are unemployed. That will provide the large army through which terrorists will recruit. So the anti-terrorism law provided that framework, and we are very happy to do that. In the law also, we followed it up with police reform. We now know that we need to build the capacity of the police to meet the new challenge. The police of yesterday cannot fight the challenges, the threats of today. We need to give them the basic tools, the basic education, the knowledge to do that. So we enacted a very ambitious police reform. I think last year we were hoping to bring the Inspector General of Police to the Institute to spell out the key aspect of the police reform in Nigeria. He was able to do that at the Institute of Peace, but I'm sure over time we'll be able to do that. So we have that in mind. Of course, the aspect of re-education, because the police also need to be abreast with global best practices. So you need to educate them. We also instituted prison reform. Again, we need to build their capacity, need to boost their infrastructure, need to ensure that they have all the tools to deal with the phenomena of prison radicalization. How do you deal with a terrorist prisoner? He is not a common criminal. How do you separate the two, and what type of attitude do you develop? It's very important. We did that. We also instituted a reform of the criminal justice system. Now that we have an anti-terrorism law, the courts need to be reviewed so that they know how to deal with terrorist cases, suspects. Do you detain? I mean, the law requires that you detain somebody for no more than 24 hours, at most 48 hours. Otherwise, you release him. If you go by that law, many of the Boko Haram suspects will be released and they are back to business. How do you deal with that challenge? So you need a criminal justice system that tries to put in place delicate balance to ensure that they are not released and they are go back to business. So we have a criminal justice system. We need to build the capacity of judges. Judges who had hitherto never confronted terrorist cases are now have to do that. You have to update their knowledge on that. You have to give them the right education, the right perspective, and all those. There is already a debate on creating special courts. That's a very sensitive area in Nigeria, just as it is in the U.S. When you create special courts, people think that you are trying to undermine human rights or even the Constitution. So we are trying to weigh the balance. How do you have special courts so that terrorists can appear? And judges are human beings. A judge would want to be sure that when he tries a terrorist suspect, he will go home and sleep and wake up tomorrow. He will not go and sleep and then terrorists who are outside attack and kill him. And that has been happening. So the issue of security is very central. So these are all issues we need to think, and we are doing that in Nigeria. Of course, we also count on the international partnership. Partnership, very important. What do you do when you have terrorist suspects across the border in Niger Republic? You can't go and arrest them. You need a warrant. You need Interpol. But if you have good cooperation with Niger Republic in the form of cooperation among the law enforcement agents, the criminal justice system, it is much easier. So we have embarked on a very robust reach out with our neighbors. We have excellent cooperation. I can assure you that terrorists from Nigeria do not have safe haven in Niger. If they are arrested, they will be returned to Nigeria and vice versa. We work excellently. The situation in Mali and indeed the whole Sahel taught us a great lesson that I always say our security is as good as our neighbors. And if our neighbor's security is not guaranteed, ours is not guaranteed too. So we have excellent relation in terms of that. Our major institutions, security services, the courts, and what have you are very closely affiliated, and we do have fantastic exchange with them. So we do have that in West Africa and the Sahel. We know also we need to go beyond that. We need to have global partnership and bilateral and multilateral level. I can tell you from my experience in Washington, the U.S.-Nigeria Binational Commission is one of the best expression of that partnership. Through that partnership, we have been able to address many concerns. Regional security concerns in Nigeria have become like concerns for the United States, and they are helping us a lot in terms of building capacity, to training our security agents, the courts, law enforcement agents, and what have you, even educating on various status, international best practices. For example, sometimes here we had discussion with the issue of piracy, and the U.S. came in very handy. We had a discussion at the Institute here on piracy, and quite a number of presented, enunciated what the U.S. has been doing to assist Nigeria in piracy. We have similar assistance. When we first have the first bombing at the UN headquarters, the FBI sent a large army, and they are still there investigating that. When our police headquarters was bombed, again they are there. The FBI is helping us in several areas, training our law enforcement agencies with forensics. They're helping us to even build a forensic laboratory, try to help us understand the advanced forensic knowledge so that it will help our investigation. It is largely because of this partnership. On the criminal justice sector, we have what they call the Global Counterterrorism Forum, established by the U.S. 2011. A whole department, a bureau in the Department of State. It has been doing a wonderful job. It's made up of over 35 countries, and Nigeria is a member. And we have benefited immensely from that partnership. About 2 months ago, I was in Nigeria. I led a team. Here we had a workshop on the criminal justice system and the fight against terrorism. And that workshop is one out of about series of workshops, about 5. The next one will take place in October. And the essence of that workshop is to build capacity of judges to deal with terrorism cases. The cases are highlighted. And side by side with that, we have another program on prison de-radicalization. They had about 2 workshops, one in Ouagadougou, one in Algiers. There will be one in Nigeria, and building capacity. Already they are doing that for the Nigerian prison, building capacity for prison service to understand how to deal with the issue of de-radicalization. So in that area, really, we are great beneficiaries, and things are really working for us. The justice system is being revitalized. So many other issues are being addressed through this global partnership. So let me try to conclude. One is that for us in Nigeria, the fight against terrorism is very complex. But I'm pleased to say that it's moving with great success. The key leadership of Boko Haram had been decimated. They are either under arrest or they've been killed. Boko Haram are on the run. They are on the run. We have achieved considerable ground. And you could see that Boko Haram has largely been confined to the northeast part of the country. Outside the northeast part of Nigeria, they are not a major threat. They are not likely to evolve to the level they had in the last 6 months to challenge authority. Of course, we have the military all over there, but that was necessitated by the situation. the police lack the capacity to contain this insurgency. So we have to deploy the military. But we have done so within the law. The law now recognizes that the military can be deployed to aid constitutional authority when you have a law and order situation. So we are operating within the law. We are very hopeful that we will achieve great success with much cooperation with our neighbors in the Sahel, but more important, with greater impetus from the international community. Global partnership is really helping us. In December last year, the National Security Advisor was invited as a special guest at the UN Counterterrorism Task Force retreat. He spoke as a special guest about Nigeria challenges in fighting terrorism, and he was highly acknowledged during that, and he spelled out our strategy. And the US, the UN, and several other global partners are helping us. You fight terrorism with a strategy. You don't fight terrorism based on just laid out perimeters. It must be a global strategy, and every time we are learning from the experience of others. We will continue to require the goodwill and the understanding of the international community. But I remain extremely positive that in the next couple of years, we'll be talking of more fundamental development issues relating to Nigeria rather than Boko Haram. Thank you very much, and God bless.
Thank you very much for your insights. Obviously, you raised many critical questions, and we will have an opportunity to come back to you. I would like to move on in the interest of time to our next speaker, Don Arbel, who is the former Deputy Chief of Mission of the Embassy of Israel, as I mentioned before. Academically, I'm delighted that we had obviously the many contributions of Israeli leaders, all the way Shimon Peres and Bibi Netanyahu, and some of the ambassadors, including Abba Eban and many others over the years, who provided a great deal of wisdom and guidance. But obviously, we discussed already the latest developments in terms of the trade-off release of prisoners and the peace process. So Don Arbel brings to our discussion a great deal of experience, at least a quarter century in the Israeli foreign ministry, serving, for example, at the UN, US, Japan, and elsewhere. He was involved in negotiating teams of Israel, for example, related to Syria and so forth. And as an academic, he was trained at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And I think his perspective is very useful, particularly now, in terms of the release of prisoners, that it's not only the question of Israel. We find countries like Iraq that this year released hundreds of prisoners who were held under the anti-terrorism statutes in order to appease in Iraq the Sunni sector against the Shiite-controlled government. So we find that this phenomenon is not only national but regional and global. Down, please.
Thank you, Professor Alexander, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here and to share the podium with such great speakers. I very much enjoyed your presentation, Ambassador. which set the stage for what I'm about to say, and I will try to be brief as we have three other colleagues waiting. And so, just to say that in offering the Israeli perspective, I do want to say that prisoner release is not unprecedented, because for over 20 years now, that Israeli governments, left and right, both sides of the aisle in Israel, have used this tool, this mechanism, this mode of operation of prisoner release in order to gain something in return. It was always done in the context of some sort of swap deal. If you go back to the 90s, when the heyday of the Oslo process, when Israeli and Palestinian negotiators were sitting across the table from each other at different junctures in that peace process, Israel was always, as a confidence-building measure, reaching a decision to release prisoners, and obviously, sort of as a confidence-building measure, expecting and agreeing ahead of time that the Palestinian side will also act in accordance and adopt its own set of confidence-building measures. But it has always been, not always, but in recent years, it has become quite a regular use of this tool for Israeli governments, and it's important to note that this particular release this month, and expected release over the next few months of several other dozens of prisoners, of terrorists, Palestinian terrorists with what we call in Israel with blood on their hands, who are convicted criminals who committed crimes and committed horrendous crimes and killing people, this has been common practice. Having said that this is common practice doesn't make it a whole lot easier, and does not move it away from an emotional public debate involving the families of the victims, involving just common people, the men in the street, and also, of course, politicians and the leadership. But leaders act and have to take leadership decisions as leaders, and sometimes they have to make unpopular decisions that run contrary to public opinion. But I think that in recent years, Israeli public opinion has been more accustomed, since this has been used in different rounds over the years. I think Israeli public opinion is more accustomed to this method, and obviously, at the end of the day, what Israeli public opinion wants to see is that if the government reaches a decision that this is what it's going to do, this is what it takes to get the job done, then they get something in return. In this point in time, what was very controversial, and the ambassador of Spain noted this earlier, is the fact that people did not see what they get in return. This was sort of a goodwill gesture by the Israeli government, and just to start off negotiations, to create the right atmosphere, but there was no tangible, there was no deliverable, nothing was given in return for this particular round of prisoner release. I can go back and mention, and again, in previous years, not only hundreds of terrorists were released by Israel, but even more than thousands of terrorists were released by Israel in different rounds of prisoner release. The Gilad Shalit deal is a famous one. Corporal Gilad Shalit, who sat in captivity by the Hamas in Gaza for over 5 years. For his return, Israel had to secure his return. Israel gave back or released hundreds of prisoners. Earlier in the 90s, for certain POWs, Israeli POWs held by Hezbollah in Lebanon, Israel also released over 1,000 prisoners, and so on. So it was important for me to note that, and also important to say that this also links to a core element in Jewish tradition, an old saying, which is, he who saves one life, it says, it is as if he had saved an entire world. And so it is seen by some that if, for the sake of this unfortunate Corporal Shalit, then it's linked to Jewish tradition, to do anything that you can in order to secure the life of one individual. But this does not take away from what was mentioned here, the moral, the emotional, the moral dilemma, the legal dilemma. And I have to say, Ambassador, that the Israeli legal Supreme Court, the High Court, as sitting as High Court of Appeals, has authorized these deals time and time again. Always, immediately after a decision is made by government, it takes 48 hours for this to take effect. And always during those 48 hours, always there's an individual or an organization that appeals the government decision. And courts, time and time again, Israeli courts have held and have backed and have gave authorization for the government's decisions. And it's important to note that it does legally hold water. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that this is a political decision that was taken by politicians, by leaders. Because when you look at this particular last deal that took place this month, the security establishment, the Shin Bet, the General Security Service of Israel, was opposed to this move. And it was leaked to the press that this is the case, that the security defense establishment in Israel opposes the release of those prisoners because of fear of revolving door, the fact that they may be back in the street and use and revert back to terrorism or be involved in terrorist acts. So Benjamin Netanyahu, as Prime Minister, despite the opposition from the security establishment, went ahead and reached this decision. And we have to look at just a few sentences. I'll just devote to that, and then I'll finish. This was in the context, as the ambassador said, of the restarting of negotiations by Secretary of State Kerry. When Secretary of State Kerry shuttled 6 times over the last few months to Israel and the Palestinian Authority, he worked out a deal between the parties in order to restart the talks. The Palestinians demanded that Israel would act to do something in terms of settlement activity and release prisoners. Politically, for Netanyahu, at this point in time, the only decision that he could make, the only move that he could take, the only step that he could adopt that will ensure the stability of the coalition, the current coalition, and the approval of the Israeli government, despite the narrow margin between the ministers, was in the domain of the prisoner release. On settlement activity, the government would have come down. And I have to say that over the years, no government has gone down, has collapsed because of a prisoner release. It was always, there are different reasons for governments to collapse or to come to an end of term, a premature end of term, not prisoner release. So this particular decision by Netanyahu has to be seen in the political context of a goodwill gesture towards the United States, a goodwill gesture towards the Palestinian, in the context of, with a hope, of course, that paying such a painful price will eventually, at the end of the day, pay off, if you can call it that way, in terms of progress in the peace process, hoping to reach a deal one day. And unfortunately, the Palestinians have not reciprocated, and as the ambassador has mentioned, do glorify these prisoners who are released. And the culture of peace in the Palestinian Authority is just very much not there, unfortunately, and that has to be definitely worked on. But I would end here, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, many issues that we would have to discuss. We'll come back to you. We're going to call on Professor Louis Shelley, who is the Director of Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at the George Mason University. She's a very distinguished, if I may say so, academic that we followed for many years. Her contributions in this country and internationally, in the Middle East, in Asia, and Europe, and elsewhere. And what is really important is to mention their contributions in terms of her writing and books and teaching the next generation of scholars and professionals. And I asked her, to obviously she can give a course here in this area. She does give courses in the field, but she can speak as long as she wants, but we'll have to finish in 10 minutes.
Right. I'll be quick.
Okay, you can sit from there if
If I can. I think the reason that Professor Alexander asked me to speak is that I'm just at the moment finalizing a book that I'm about to send off in a couple weeks on the relationship of crime, corruption, and terrorism. And throughout this book, the prison figures in almost every chapter. And so, the book starts off re-examining starting with 9/11 and the 5 most deadly terrorist attacks of the 2000s. And if you go in and look at the crime and corruption and the forces behind these attacks, you will find the prison in half of them. And one of the points that was made earlier about separating out terrorists from criminals is that it's not so easy, because a lot of terrorist activity is now funded by crime. And therefore, terrorists are often arrested as criminals, not as terrorists. They're arrested for the petty criminal activity that they've committed. They're operating, say, in Western Europe under false documents and false passports. So when no one knows they've gotten a terrorist, they've gotten a criminal, he's put in with other criminals, and he recruits people for terrorism and he recruits them for crime at the same time. I see one of my former students here who's worked with Professor Alexander, who's French. And one of the first things I published in my academic career, which was a long time ago, was about a review of a book called Discipline and Punish by a very eminent French scholar named Foucault. And he wrote about the prison as being the tool or representative of the Industrial Revolution and the order that it imposed on society. But that's not the prison today. The prison today is the corporate headquarters of criminals and terrorists who, because of corruption, and we've talked about governance generally and transparency, but we haven't talked about corruption in prison, which is a problem in the United States, it's a problem in Western Europe, it's a problem in Central Asia, it's a problem everywhere. And because of this corruption of guards, criminals and terrorists have cell phones, they have computers, and they are carrying on and communicating from prison and carrying out their activities with perfect equanimity because they have bought off the authorities. So, yes, they can get released, but it is not really that much of a hindrance for them to be in prison today. It may not be as comfortable as the life they're living outside, but for some of them, they're used to living in very difficult circumstances. One of the most interesting cases that I write about in the book is what is going on in Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, in which the criminals, to bribe the prison officials, have something that in prison slang is known as the obshak, which is the fund that's gathered each month from the prisoners to pay off and maintain their authority in the prison over the prison authorities. But in Kyrgyzstan, the obshak is not maintained by the criminals anymore, it's maintained by the terrorists, who then are controlling the corruption in the prison through their collection of money. So this is some of the very interesting trends that we're seeing that we need to be thinking about more. And I think we're also need to be thinking about some of what I would call the new types of terrorism that are not necessarily just terrorist organizations, but where criminals are using terrorist attacks against the citizenry, such as occurred in Sao Paulo, Brazil, in which the whole city was shut down, hundreds of people were killed, and the launch of this attack on Sao Paulo was launched by a criminal group, which is a very politicized criminal group, from the prison, where the whole attack was organized and then orchestrated from the prison. So we need to be thinking about prisons in different ways as dynamic institutions that are at the core of what I call these dirty entanglements of crime, corruption, and terrorism. Thank you.
As I said, many of the people would register for your classes in the fall. We do have young people here who are trying to get into this field, and in fact we do have in the back here a French lawyer, Marie. Why don't you stand up, say hello? She was also a student of Professor Shelley, and we tried to kidnap her for our work here. At any rate, our final speaker as panelist, I invited Colonel T. Murphy right here to participate in the discussion, because in addition to his very distinguished military background as a pilot and serving the United States Air Force in many countries like Korea, Germany, and Japan, I was impressed with the very important, I think, assignment you had as a military attaché and advisor to the U.S. ambassador in Israel. And when we spoke, I was delighted when I realized that you retired, and we invited you to join our academic work. But I thought perhaps you can shed some light on the discussion we had, and particularly to look at the experience. What are some of the lessons that you think from the Israeli case and the American case? So you're welcome to come here if you'd like to. Or
thank you. I'll just stay here.
Okay.
Because I'm going to make this very brief. I'll summarize my thoughts in just a couple of minutes. We've already touched pretty well on the Israeli experience. What I would like to do is just tie that into what I think we'll see in the American experience to come. There's really, you have these prisoners from the war on terror, and then you say, okay, what now? What do we do with them? What's our experience? And there's really 4 ways that other than dying, that people get out of prison. One is they escape. One is they're released. And Mr. Arbel has touched on a couple of ways that happens in Israel, either for confidence building or in trades for Israeli captives. And one is that they actually serve out a sentence and they're released at the end of a sentence. In the Israeli experience, there's actually quite a few that are those latter ones. They're actually tried and convicted and held for a time and then released at the end of a sentence. As we've noted, that there's quite a few, quite a long history of prisoners being released in the Israeli experience, either for confidence building or in trades for prisoners. In the Israeli experience, to my knowledge, is that there are very, very few that escape. The prisons are pretty secure, a long way away from help and the kinds of things that happen. Now, how is that going to sort of work out in the experience of the United States and its allies? Well, we obviously, and especially in our recent experience here, have a much tougher problem with prison escapes. Other than Guantanamo Bay, most of the places where people are held are, broad range of security, a broad range of people that might be able to help them that are close or somewhere that are in a place to be able to help. So we're going to see much more of that than in the Israeli experience. Now, the release for prisoner exchange or for confidence building, we have not seen too much of, but there's some reporting, just very recently that we released that I haven't been able to independently confirm. Maybe somebody can here. We released some Guantanamo prisoners to the Taliban as a confidence building gesture. So whether that actually happened or not, we're going to see that as a possibility in our future. Likewise, we're going to see the pressure to release prisoners in exchange. The Taliban is holding a single U.S. soldier, Bo Bergdahl, now, and there's been some talks about having an exchange for him, but I think that we're likely to see that in the future. We'll see how we do in terms of actually convicting and holding prisoners for a good long time. I'm just going to close with the thought of there's an excellent article in 2010 by Evelyn Gordon on the risks of being involved in this, and Israel has experienced all those risks, as Mr. Arbel pointed out. What I will point out in closing here is one of those risks, one of the downside is you sort of encourage terrorism and undermine the peace process, because the lesson on the other side is terrorism works, that, hey, this works. If I hold people and then release them, that's better. And in the unfortunate case with Israel, the prisoner releases in exchange for an Israeli prisoner tend to be very big and come all at once, as opposed to the confidence building ones that are slower and over time and very often not even executed in the full number of prisoners that they talked about at the beginning, because confidence breaks down and all that. This does have some huge impacts for the United States, I think, in the future, in terms of people trying to pick up Israel or United States soldiers or other citizens and then use them as bargaining chips to release either very high value or large number of prisoners. And I think that's something we're going to have to deal with in the future. There's much more I could say, but there's a very distinguished panel here, and I'd love to hear from you if we can. So thank you for your time, and thanks for the invitation.
Since we started a little bit late, we have some time for Q&A, and of course there are some areas that the panel did not go into. For example, hunger strikes at prisons, and the impact. And we had it all over the place in Israel as well, and then of course the riots that we had. So I like to invite our audience to ask questions or to raise some issues. Please identify yourself for the record, and you can address a particular, panelist or in general. Please.
Hi, my name is Diana Giorgenti. I'm with B'nai B'rith International, but I'm also kind of here on my own this afternoon. And this is just a general question to whomever might feel confident in answering it. I appreciate the ambassador's remarks touching on the psychology of prisoners, terrorist prisoners, and I was hoping, I followed a study of two professors out of the University of Maryland who have been working in Sri Lanka and their de-radicalization and rehabilitation program, and I was hoping someone might be able to speak to that as a possible conditionality for these prisoner releases that so many of you have talked about. I know Ambassador Abdu spoke about workshops to that effect, so I welcome your responses. Thank you.
You want to respond to that? Or?
Yeah. I will speak in general and then more specifically what applies to Nigeria. The Department of State, under the auspices of the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, organizes a workshop on prison de-radicalization, and is essentially tailored to addressing the key issue that terrorists work on narratives. And what you need to do is change the narrative. And the only way to change the narrative is to bring another narrative for peace this time, not narrative for destruction, for insurgency. And they do organize workshops for when terrorists recruit, they use the narratives to radicalize their victims. When they go to prison, it's not just a question of them spending their time there and paying for the offense. It's very important that before they come out, you change their view, their attitude. And these workshops are organized to remove such narratives and bring a better narrative for them. More often than not, I saw one or two, particularly in relation to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, radicalized operatives in Yemen. They try to teach them about their own perspective of Islam. The tendency is to see the U.S. as an enemy of Islam, and those of them that are trying to challenge it are actually seeking to advance the cause of the religion. And some of the things they try to show is that more often than not, they recruit you for the money. They recruit you to do one or two things, and then they try to bring in the narrative how these people who recruited the terrorists actually try to rid themselves, how they actually are not even true Muslims in the real sense of the word. More often than not, the narrative is one that detach those who actually sell that ideology as if they are immune from that, and then they show them in their true color. So this is one aspect. It's the same thing. Boko Haram, basically the ideology is that they want to establish a state governed by Sharia in a multi-religious society. I mean, it's absurd. I mean, in Islam, even I'm a Muslim. It's a la fiqra fi din. There's no compulsion in the religion. So you cannot compel anybody to take the religion. It's clear in the Quran. So you know, this kind of narrative, you need to really sell it, and you need to sell it. You need to popularize it, and some of these radical extremist elements write the religious scripture. They write it to project what they think the religion should be. So you need to rewrite it to bring it to the original form and try to show that. That has been used immensely in Algeria, where they try to, you know, sometimes they go on preaching. When the terrorist leader, the first leader, Mohammed Yusuf, is a very eloquent preacher, very popular. If you listen to him, very convincing. You love to hear him, very articulate. And that within that articulation and the rest, he will articulate the wrong ideas. So it's very important to find somebody with similar talent and skill who will articulate correct ideas, and that could be projected either through platforms or sometimes in books to change the narrative. So basically, that's how it is done, and there are various. Depending on the scenario, the kind of narrative the terrorists use, you need to counter it. De-radicalization starts with countering doing counter narrative itself. That's the major aspect, and there are several other issues. Thank you.
Anyone else at the panel? Incidentally, the Sri Lankan case is very instructive because we find the whole issue of kidnapping of children and the indoctrination process, and in fact to instill the culture of death. And each one had, the capsule. I don't have one exactly, there's something else, but at any rate, so they were prepared to commit suicide. And of course, we learned a great deal about suicide bombers from Sri Lanka. So there are cases like this, and will be delighted to provide you with the information. The bottom line about all this, again, it seems to me, is the confrontation between the culture of life and the culture of death. And that's what we have to keep in mind. Education, for example, in hatred, which really means that we have to deal with the next generation of children who will become terrorists. And at least we would have to deal with this issue for the next 100 years. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir. Yeah, here is the mic.
It seems to me that the whole question of terrorism, as Ambassador Ruperes began saying in his presentation, from its very inception, there's a lack of definition of what terrorism is. And of course, I think back to the 19th century or the 18th century, patriots, people we call patriots, were to some extent considered by the offended power as terrorists. And of course, that continues to today. There's nothing new about that. One man's hero is another man's terrorist. But also, I think the real problem is not so much the prison, but as you started saying, Ambassador Abdu, that the underlying causes are really what is at stake here. And of course, I think of the issue that maybe Mr. Arbel could refer to, recidivism, when you were talking about Palestinians released from Israeli, prisons. So it doesn't seem that there's any kind of a unified approach that one can take towards the word terrorism. It really depends on what region. And my question's coming up. When I think of the Near East, I think so much of the frustrated nationalisms and, if you would, even tribal consciences that were not given full reign after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. I think the columnist Gerson today mentioned that tangentially in his op-ed in the Post. But that's an issue that people don't talk about, particularly in major media discussions. What are the underlying reasons for some of the problems in the Middle East? Well, and in Africa, that, if you would, tribal boundaries were not respected in the transition from World War I to II and so forth after the imperial powers gave up their territories. So it's all a very mixed bag. You can't compare ETA with the FARC and M19, and you can't compare them with the IRA or Boko Haram. And I don't get a real sense, and I guess this is my question and my frustration, how do you approach such a diverse subject and come out of it with any sort of a substantial proposition or proposal on how you avoid terrorist prisoners? The treatment is one thing, is the criminal system too lenient? Can you get the international community to agree on what constitutes proper criminal justice? I mean, all these issues you've all brought up brilliantly, but I'm not going to walk out of here with a clear sense in my mind of, okay, so now what? Other than continuing doing more of the same. Wonderful bilateral cooperation, international consensus building. But where do you people come out from all of this? Is there a magic bullet that you can talk about? I'm obviously trying to provoke something here.
Okay, we're going to ask each one will have a chance. Okay. So you're not going to leave this room without some sort of insights. Yeah. Okay.
No, there is no silver bullet, obviously, as I pointed out before. But there is a rather large universal consensus, even without a definition, of what we are talking about and how to deal with the phenomenon. So whenever we have the use of violence for political reasons, with the idea of changing the basic structure of society, we do have terrorism. And you can sort of change the elements of that definition, but that's terrorism. And I would point out two documents. One of them is a formal document of the Security Council. Another one is a document which was promoted by Kofi Annan when was he Secretary General in the year 2000. There is a resolution 1373 of the Security Council, which was passed unanimously, as far as I remember, by the Security Council a few weeks after 9/11, which is, if you want, the Bible of the fight against terrorism, and where all the elements that you are referring as the silver bullet are there. Another thing is whether people respect them or not, and certainly most of them do not respect. But in terms of what is terrorism about, how to deal with it, how to deal with the police, how to deal with the judiciary, how to deal with the elements, the economic side of it, everything is there. And I think I would very strongly recommend the reading of. And the other one is a document, rather long document, which was produced in the year 2000, which is something like, it was put forward by the General Assembly, something like the responses about the challenges and problems of the modern world. And this is a long document. It was a sort of group of wise people put together by the Secretary General of the United Nations with the instruction to reflect upon the problems of the modern times. And one of the chapters is dedicated to terrorism. And it's not the law, but it's extremely useful reflection on terrorism. And one of the things it says, and I fully agree with that, is that one thing is to try and explain why terrorists become terrorists, and another thing is to try and justify terrorism. Because many people do the jump, and saying, well, the downtrodden of the earth. Well, first of all, the downtrodden of the earth normally don't become terrorists. The leaders of terrorist groups are not the downtrodden of the earth.
Absolutely.
They are rather well-to-do people. That's one thing. But even if they are the downtrodden of the earth, even if they are hungry and they have another problems, they are not justified to use terrorism, because otherwise we will go back to the law of the barbarian times. So that's. But I would recommend even. I could go on, because one of the things the United Nations is trying to do is precisely just to narrow those things. And the third point, by the way, and I'm sorry that Professor Shelley is not there. In Spain we've learned one thing about the terrorists in prison, is that you never put them together with the common criminals, on a number of reasons. And certainly then you have a number of restrictions. The ETA prisoners are not the Al-Qaeda prisoners, so we don't have exactly the problem of radicalization, because the ETA prisoners are not trying to convince the others of the independence of the Basque Country, but the ETA prisoners try, first of all, to keep a very high degree of violence in the prisons. And that's something that the common criminals do not. They have different codes of conduct. And another thing is that you have to try and keep security within the prison. The common criminals behave in a certain way. I wouldn't say they are saints. They are not. But they do not normally provoke the problems that terrorists within the prisons provoke. And the third point is that for the terrorists themselves, to be together is one of the main factors of the activity within the prison and outside the prison. And the final point is that one thing that terrorists do not like is to be in prison for life. So whenever you keep them there, at a given point in time they start thinking, well, I did something wrong, because even the promises of those who told me, well, you go there and kill someone because after all we'll take care of you, they are not able to take care of you. You are going to serve your sentence. And this is something which demoralizes profoundly the thing. So that's, but read 1373, it's worth reading.
Thank you very much. Again, in the interest of time, because I know some of the people have to leave. Don, you have to,
soon.
2 minutes.
One minute. Okay.
I'm not I don't
Okay.
Yeah, I share your frustration, and I will admit that I was in Harvard last week, and when the lecturer came to speak about global terrorism, he brought exactly the definition Ambassador raised, that's the closest the world has come to an acceptable definition, those documents of the UN. And he eloquently highlighted them. In 2009, there was a conference on global terrorism in Malaysia. It's a 3-day conference. The first day was devoted to finding a definition. They couldn't find one, and that was the end of the conference. It didn't take place. So that is understandable. You will walk out with ambassador's recommendation. If you read that, I'm sure you will be happy. That is the bullet you are talking of. Thank you.
Don, no, okay. Well,
I'll just say very quickly, I'm a little bit skeptical on this point. That some people just participate in terrorist activity because that's what they want to do. Particularly with recidivism, and I'll talk about that very briefly. Studies from one of the Israeli Victims Association to about 15%, and that was just for murder or attempted murder. So you know that the participation is much higher than that. To an American study had about 30%. I think probably both of those are low. That when people are let go from prison, they go back to it. A good number of them, and in the Israeli experience, they know this. They know they're going to pick some of these people up later. Sheikh Yassin, they arrested him, released him twice before he was killed in the 2004 airstrike. We're going to see that too. So yeah, some people will say, "Yeah, I'm tired of this. I'm going to go do something else." Some of the hardcore people, it's an issue of he's probably going to go back to terrorism, but is it in my interest for other reasons to release him? Yeah, it is. I'll let him go, realizing that I may see him again.
Okay. Again, we have to really close, and I'm tempted always when we have a statement like one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. I have a problem with that, simply because I think it's a conceptual bankruptcy that we have to deal with, because justice is one, but people call it by different names. My colleague, Professor Don Wallace, you were very patient for a long time, and I think if you would kindly make some closing remarks.
I only look patient.
Use the mic.
Just make one observation, because we don't have any time really. People want their cake and eat it too. You see that with the surveillance, the NSA. On the one hand, people should be safe, but they want everyone to have civil liberties. And I would say that's certainly one of the issues here which troubles questioners. I personally believe in lifetime indefinite detention for under the laws of war for some of the people in Guantanamo. But I think if you examine all these things, what our colleague from Nigeria said, we want everything. We want the rule of law, we want safety, and I don't have the time to thread that needle for you. I could do it privately, but I won't do it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, the dialogue will continue, and we are planning to have an event on September 11th to mark the anniversary, but also in honor and memory of the victims of terrorism. I'm sorry? You have a question?
Oh, I didn't have a question. I'm sorry. I had a question about Turkey. Because Turkey is also, I'm Turkish. I'm from UVA. Anyhow, so Turkey also has a serious issue with tourism since the 1980s with the KKK. Now, the government, and starting especially from 2007, starting from 2007, kind of reached out in terms of expanding ethnic minority rights, not only for Kurds, but also alibis and so forth. But more recently, it's also actually reached out to KKK itself, and its leader, Abu Bakr, who was prisoned and who was continuing to support and kind of stir stuff up while he was in prison. So now there's this government who has been trying to, liberalize its ethnic policy, even trying to engage in diplomacy rather than conflict with the KKK. So that's given. Now, on the other hand, you have a domestic population who, informed by ethno-linguistic style of nationalism, is just so against whatever the government does when it comes to ethnic minority rights. Now, that not only includes the government's attempt to negotiate, if you would with the KKK, but simply just expansion of rights. So the government, it seems like is pressured, like in between. We want to have peace. We don't, because it's also military expenditure, right? It's not just love and all that stuff. There's also a lot of money that's being spent throughout conflict out in the field. And then there's also this, population who's so against it. And then you have the European Union watching Turkey, especially, until 2010, 2011. And then you have the civil society human rights situation and some political parties that are connected, at least in terms of sentiments, to the KKK. So what does the government do, given 7 months later we have elections? So do you give up on your political legitimacy? Do you give up on your political legitimacy for the sake of, keeping power? Or do you prefer peace and then lose political legitimacy? So how much space does the state have? What should it do? I don't know if that makes sense.
I'm sure that Professor Alexander is going to organize a seminar dedicated to the PKK.
You're absolutely right, and in fact you are invited
Thank you.
to speak on September 11 because, as you know, the threat of terrorism is, as we say, global. In fact, at 9/11, we had the citizens of over 90 countries who were victimized, not only the United States. And that's why it comes back to the original question, Mr. Ambassador, when I asked whether civilization will survive, and I fully agree with you. We will if we want to. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you.
Can I call you?
Sure,
Yeah, I'd love to come sit down.
Yeah, absolutely.